Good late morning Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice's press conference on finance issues here at COP29 in Baku. I'll just quickly introduce what the lineup is going to be here. First, on my right, we'll hear from Liddy Nakpil, one of the DCJ coordinating committee members from the Asia People's Movement on Debt and Development, and also a co-founder of the Pay Up campaign, the cross-constituency effort to escalate climate finance. And then from Costa Rica, we'll hear from Adrian Martinez Blanco about finance issues and particularly loss and damage throughout the Americas. And then last, the big question, how to pay for it. We have with us today Bronwyn Tucker from the Oil Change International based in Washington, although I don't think you live in Washington, but you know all about the money in Washington, so she'll be talking about how to pay for it. And I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm Victor Minotti from the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, and I'll just be moderating, other than to say we're going to give about 5 minutes to each speaker and then hopefully leave about 15 minutes or so for question and answer. And what else to say? Well, this is the finance COP, and the first signs are that it's not really on track to deliver the kind of deal at scale and urgency that the world needs, or certainly that developing countries need. What we saw yesterday, the taking note of the Article 6 carbon market standards, we're concerned will be presented as climate finance, but we're very clear that carbon finance is not climate finance, so we're going to hear more what climate finance looks like in terms of the quantum that's needed, in terms of the quality that's needed, in terms of access and other issues that are important, particularly for those communities most impacted in the global south, and what those of us from the global north, such as myself, how to get our governments to pay up. So let me turn to my right to Liddy.
Good morning, everyone. I come from a movement in the Philippines, and I think many of you know that the Philippines is probably one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change because of many factors. And just the past week, we have been hit by several super typhoons, one after the other. And many people have, as usual, suffered dislocation, displacement, loss of lives, loss of homes, loss of livelihoods. And this is what we face year after year, and we all know that it keeps getting worse. I start with that because we would like to remind the negotiators in this conference that we're not just talking about numbers here. We are, that's very important, the quantum in the NCQG, but we're actually talking about, behind those numbers, people's lives. And we have been building up this, I wouldn't say just simply disappointment, but this rage over how negotiations have been going, not just for the last several years, but for the last almost 2 decades on the issue of climate finance, but especially since 2007, when in Bali, climate finance was identified as very, very key to many of the climate actions, because without the delivery of climate finance, we will not be able to deliver on mitigation, on adaptation, and now of late, a very urgent issue, loss and damage, and then the realization that all of this needs to happen in an equitable and just manner. So we're also talking about just transition. In 2009 in Copenhagen, we could not believe that the offer of developed country governments led by the United States was $100 billion. We could not believe this, not because it was a considerable amount, but because it was such a pittance compared to what we already knew then. The cost of not only mitigation and adaptation, but also loss and damage, and the cost of just transition is going to be in the trillions, if not billions, and not billions. And there were studies already made even then that all of this is going to be even more expensive if there's going to be further delay in climate action. And that is what we have seen since then, more delays year after year. We have been building up this rage because every year we hear more of the same arguments from developed country governments. First, they say, there's not enough public money. We cannot deliver the amounts that you're asking for because there's not enough public money. And my colleague Bronwyn here will testify that there's more than enough public money out there, and it's not for a lack of money, but for a lack of political will that this cannot be mobilized. Then they say the key is in the private sector financing, not in public, because there is much more money in the private sector than the governments have. And the government's role using public money is to incentivize the private sector to be involved in climate action. And that means, of course, making climate action more profitable for the private sector, less risky for the private sector. So they're talking about using public funds to provide guarantees, to provide incentives, and to de-risk private sector development, private sector capital involvement in climate action.
2 minutes.
Then they tell us that the other answer is to expand the contributor base. You know, there are many developing country governments and countries that can actually afford to contribute significantly to the cost of climate action in the developing world. But they don't say, actually, that in reality, we have been paying for our own climate action for the longest time. There is a study that is actually pointing out that the developing countries, 85% of what we spend on climate action comes from our own pockets. And there's 15% or even less that's coming from overseas. And part of that 15% coming from overseas are coming from other South countries. So when they're talking about expanding the contributor base, they don't know what they're talking about, or they're actually outrightly lying or trying to deceive the rest of us. We're here to say that they owe us at least $5 trillion a year. So this negotiations is not going to mean anything to us unless they talk about trillions and not billions. And we're here to say that those trillions have to be in public funds. We're not saying the public sector has no role. They definitely have to mobilize their funds in order to participate in climate action, because a lot of the fault lies with corporations who insist on using fossil fuels and expanding fossil fuels and making profits. We're not here to say that there is no role for other southern governments in helping each other in South-South cooperation. But we're here to say that public funds is vital. We cannot leave this to the markets. Our governments have to take leadership in this process, and they need public funds. So we're here to continue our effort for the Pay Up campaign. They must pay up. They owe us, not just in terms of climate finance. It's only part of the broader reparations that we in the South are owed. And we are owed not only for our own sake, but because our actions in the South will save this planet and will save all people everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Liddy. We'll keep moving to Adrian.
So, why climate reparations? If your house was set on fire, would you accept a loan from the culprit to rebuild it? Would you ask for charity as a response? Or wouldn't your demand be justice? Wouldn't you expect for the culprit to be held responsible, to pay for all the loss and damage? Wouldn't you say that's common sense? Wouldn't you say that is the law in most of our countries? Wouldn't you say that is international law, human rights law? It is. Yet in the context of the UNFCCC, culprits make profits out of victims. become donor countries, set the agenda for everyone else. And you know, that is called corruption. That is global north structural corruption. That is the clearest sign that colonialism is alive at the UNFCCC. And it is also the basis of why we fight for justice at COP21, why we demand the right for remedy, for climate reparations to be enforced, for human rights and international law to retake its central role in the climate regime, because it does not have a central role in these negotiations. It hasn't for many decades already. Loss and damage is transboundary environmental harm, meaning that the consequences of all the economic actions that have caused climate change, those are the things that are destroying our homes, our territories, our cultures, our identity, and destroying our future. All of these culprits are manipulating this process to avoid responsibility. They present false solutions where financial arrangements transform victims into indebted people. Culprits that generate environmental harms turn themselves into donors, into people that provide charity to the victims. But they avoid constantly and structurally responsibility. And also, our countries in the Global South have an obligation to protect our land, to claim their rights in international law, which they have not done so in the last 3 decades on climate change. This is a structural reform that we fight for, where geopolitical power is tamed by justice, by law, which is not what happens in the plenaries in this COP, where we see our people recover our rights, and that this process transforms into one center in human dignity, science, and nature. The loss and damage process has a long road ahead. We have not finished with it. We had not accomplished what we set forth in the discussions in 1992 about responsibility, about compensation, about our rights being respected. Much work is needed for this process and the loss and damage agenda to conform with international law and human rights. And the clearest example is the own report of the Secretary General on the Loss and Damage Fund and how it does not conform with human rights. And it is not built to protect human rights. And it is built to foster profit, to generate a mechanism that is not based on obligations, and to facilitate global north countries to avoid responsibility and maintain their role as donors, even though they're the culprits. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. And then last, we're going to hear from Bronwyn Tucker, Oil Change International, about how to pay for it.
Thanks, Victor. And the bottom line here is that there's no shortage of public money for rich countries to pay their fair share for climate action at home and abroad. There is really just a shortage of political will. So we have released analysis earlier this year, and I can make the link available, that shows that the Annex 2 countries, the global north countries, have an obligation to pay up for climate action, and we have the tools. We can mobilize well over $5 trillion a year by ending fossil fuel handouts, by taxing the super rich, and by changing unfair global financial rules. This $5.3 trillion is by no means the only funding available. The global financial architecture is essentially a casino that is rigged towards countries like Canada, where I'm from, the G7, and much of the OECD. So we've seen in very recent past these countries mobilize trillions to bail out big banks in 2008, to pay for a COVID-19 response, to pay for massive wars. So beyond the tools that I'll go through, there's lots of monetary policy that is available to these countries and other levers. We've just focused on the ones that some of the tools that are doing the most harm in our economy, in places we can shift public money or tax corporations fairly where they're not being where that's not being done. And so the excuse that Canada, where I'm from, and our peers cannot afford to pay to stop climate breakdown and save lives is a fiction. This is an excuse nearly as old as the UNFCCC, and it's a big reason that we're sitting in 2024 with flooding all over the world, with continued fossil fuel expansion, and with record fossil fuel profits. And it's also the same excuse that we hear a lot at home. It's what the Canadian government says is the reason we can't phase out the oil sands, why we can't fix the housing crisis, and why we can't make sure everyone can pay for groceries. And so pursuing the measures that I'll speak about is something that will benefit all of us. We can unlock more than enough money to pay for the strong NCQG that we need, and also to address crises at home. And so, yeah, just to go through a bit of a grocery bill, or a bill quickly. We can start at the source. The biggest driver of the climate crisis is fossil fuels. If rich countries stop funding fossils and tax extraction, stop paying for massive highway expansions, we can redistribute $615 billion a year. If we tax the rich, crack down on tax havens, and pursue financial transaction taxes, that adds $3.2 trillion a year. Taxing corporations fairly would be $690 billion a year. Defunding the military spending by just 20% is $260 billion a year, and canceling unfair debts and redistributing special drawing rights or new non-US dollar currencies would be $610 billion a year. And so the last thing I'll say is just that there is a lot of momentum behind these proposals. We're seeing a lot of geopolitics shift. We're seeing new alliances of countries increasingly push back against the really unfair global economy that we have. And so these are things that can be done. We saw a new UN tax convention adopted this year that can make strides towards some of the tax haven and tax justice proposals. We saw the Global South countries a few years ago push and win a loss and damage fund. And so there is precedent for global coordination on these issues. And there's also strong political reasons at home and strong movements in Canada and other countries pushing for our governments to pursue these measures. And yeah, I will just end and say, this is not charity, it's a legal and moral obligation. And we absolutely can pay for it.
Thank you, Bronwyn. We have about 9 minutes left. Would love to prioritize questions from the press, please. Or any hands, please? Right here.
And then at the back.
So I've been listening about many ideas, such as the. Sorry.
Good morning, all. Thank you very much for the great panelists and all those great insights. So we've been listening about many possible mechanisms, so how we can get private money and how it's not really a tension between the logic of public financing or private. It could be both. So my question is more about how we allocate as efficiently as possible. And equal rights organization that I represent, we think that a universal basic income could be a great option for allocation directly to communities. So I would love to hear from you what is your idea of not just how to get money for loss and damage, but how to allocate it in the best possible way. Thank you.
Who'd like to take that?
Yeah. If we're talking specifically loss and damage, because climate finance is for a variety of purposes, but if we're talking specifically about loss and damage, one of the most important provision that we have been demanding is the immediate disbursement. No, because current processes in financial channels are too slow. So we need the loss and damage fund to be able to act quickly in disbursing these funds. So there should be immediate responses whenever there is an occurrence of a climate-related disaster that requires addressing loss and damage. And for that reason, it will be difficult to make it based on income, because these disasters don't happen all together in different places. They happen at different times in different places, and the scale of loss and damage is also different in different places. So the problem right now actually is not so much that we are worried about it not being quick enough, but that there's very little funds. Even if they disburse quickly, and in fact, if they disburse quickly, it can also quickly all get used up because there's very, very little funds. Maybe Adrian can add a few other things about the loss and damage.
Yeah, I think when we think about how to provide funds for loss and damage, it's up to the communities themselves on how to decide what is the best way, especially in their context, because money itself can also generate harm if it is provided in a way that is not culturally and economically sensitive to the context of a people. So the solutions and how it has to be built from the ground up. And this is something that we're very concerned about, how the mechanisms are now, not only if they're going to provide direct access to communities, but will communities be part of this process? Because they have not. And there's not a place that is as devoid of public participation as the UNFCCC in terms of involving people from frontline communities, or just involving people in general to effectively participate in decision making. So this is the first thing that we have to change.
There's a microphone there. We have maybe 5 minutes left, or 4.
Okay. Thank you. I'm by the names of Nancy. I'm representing World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts. I'm here for advocating the inclusive of girls on all over the climate solution that you are implying and you plan to have in the future. How are we saying that girls are going to thrive based on climate impacts, and how do you plan to include them in those little funds you have or you plan to have? Thank you.
First of all, the actual disbursement of this climate finance will be through this multilateral financial institutions. Like, for instance, right now, adaptation and mitigation is through the Green Climate Fund. Then it goes to governments or implementing entities, which can also be NGOs. So at the global level, we do need to strengthen our campaigning and advocacy so that the policies at the multilateral financial institutions level, like the Green Climate Fund or the Loss and Damage Fund, take into account the differentiated impacts among girls, women, vis-a-vis other parts of the population, but not just. There are different vulnerable constituencies that have different impacts. Secondly, they have to be more empowering of this constituency so that, as Adrian was saying earlier, they need to be able to participate at the decision making and to give their inputs at the decision making at the global level. We were successful to some extent with the Green Climate Fund because they have a gender and women's policy that we really worked hard for. And we now need to see this also take place at the Loss and Damage Fund. But I also emphasize at the national level, because at the national level is where it also matters even more, because once the money is disbursed at the national level, whether it goes straight to a government agency or an international, sometimes NGO, then it's another matter of making sure that the policies, especially the implementing policies, are gender just and gender sensitive.
I'll just add quickly, I think one area where we hear most that private finance can do the lifting is in the energy transition, and I think this has massive gender impacts as well, where if this is, we can see, for example, where loans on unfair terms are being given to provide energy access, that debt is left with primarily with women, and we can also see the lack of energy transition and fossil fuel production, where I'm coming, has massive gender impacts as well. And if we don't have public funding to have the transition happen in a fair way, that'll continue to also promote gender inequality.
Okay, we need to end it there. More questions, conversation outside the door if you care to join us. But thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again tomorrow about this time for the next DCJ Daily Presser. Thank you.
We'd like to invite you to join the 11:30 press conference on our solidarity with Palestine. Thank you.